if you're on the West Coast. We are a minute away from starting, so just thanks for joining us. We will start right at 1 o'clock. Great to see so many people here. Hey, Terrence.
Hi, everyone.
Hey, Patricia.
Hi.
We're just admitting everyone now, and we'll get started in about a minute. Diana, I see your hand is up. Is there a technical issue, or are you just testing out the features? Dinah. It might have been Dinah. I'm sorry. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Uh, and thank you for joining us today as we set up on a day to celebrate. We're celebrating the 20th anniversary of our EEOC's Management Directive 715. My name is Dexter Brooks. I'm the Associate Director of the Office of Federal Operations within the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And I have the pleasure today of serving as your host and moderator. Before we get started in our presentation, because we're going to have an exciting panel, and today's panel we're going to focus on, what it took to really implement this directive over the last 20 years. So we're going to talk about the concept and creation of the document and policy document. We're going to talk about the implementation years, talk about training and outreach that was conducted to support the directive. And then we're going to talk about the present and future of MD 715. And of course, we would enjoy hearing some of your questions or comments. We're going to be using the chat feature today. If you have any technical issues, put it in the chat. We have a team monitoring the messaging going back and forth, and they'll be looking for questions, and they'll also be looking for any technical issues that folks may be having. So I will introduce each panelist as we get into the event. But I thought, and the team that put this together, we had a organizing committee, great folks, led by one of our senior attorney advisors, William Tadelius. Um, and let me get the whole team. And then this project's been led by Anitra Green, with the help of Ahmad Burris, Marquis Willoughby, and Candace Clark, who also manages our education consortium. And this is an event we're doing today through our education consortium. So some of you may already be members, and that's how you got notice of this through our listserv of the education consortium. But it's our effort to really create a community within the EEO community where you can get information, events, give input, network. Uh, I'm doing my shameless plug of EdCon now, but EdCon provides you with so many different vehicles. We have an advisory board of federal leaders that help set the agenda for EdCon every year. Some of this information you can find on our website, but as you know, we do webinars. We most recently, last year, started a mentoring program for EEO professionals that's been running, and this is the second year running. And we also, this year, introduced new communities of practice. So we established a harassment community of practice for those who work in the anti-harassment programs. And later this year, we'll try to launch another community of practice focused on data in support of MD 715 and other things that we do. So, stay engaged with EdCon. It's growing. We recently put up a repository of resources that we hope to continue to populate. And, let us know some of your inputs, things that you would like to see us do through this EdCon vehicle. And thanks so much to Sharon Halstead and Candace Clark and Marcus Artis and those who have been working on the EdCon effort. Not forgetting Anitra, who was the first program director, and Patricia St. Clair, who actually launched the EdCon platform for us at EEOC. But today's EdCon event focuses on our Management Directive 715. And this year marks the 20th year. We started MD 715 at the beginning of FY 2004 through the leadership of Carlton Haddon, who's still our office director. Carlton was fairly new as the office director back in 2003, 2002 when we started this effort, and really had seen a lot of the history and wanted to make sure that this was something that was implemented as one of his first major accomplishments as the director of the Office of Federal Operations. And Carlton put together a team to really lay out what was necessary to implement a new policy directive in this space, and had a team of individuals. So when I talk to the first, when I do the first panel or the first interview with individuals, it will be one of the folks that was one of our leaders. But and she's and you'll meet Gail in a few minutes. But she was not alone. There were other folks that I would just like to acknowledge that were a part of the early efforts with MD 715, whether in terms of work groups, implementation, that are not a part of the panel today, but really should be noted. And like I said, Carlton Haddon is probably the most significant, but also Cassandra Minokin, who was one of our attorney advisors who worked very closely with Gail Black on the creation of the document, along with Catherine McNamara, Jolinda Johnson, Gail Demers, and then folks who really helped us implement through the years like Barbara Doherty and Nina Andreu, and the many different division directors that worked on this project. It is a communal effort. This is not something done by one person. It was the best thoughts that we had at EEOC at that time. But what led to the implementation of this new directive? And when we say this is the 20th anniversary, I don't want you to think that we've only been doing this type of work in the government for 20 years. Actually, the affirmative employment programs as a part of the federal sector really has another anniversary this year. It's been in place for 55 years, came about through an executive order under the Nixon administration, Executive Order 11478. President Nixon signed in August of 1969, that really laid out what was the expectation of the federal government in terms of equal employment opportunity. And one provision was that each federal agency should have affirmative employment programs for, recruitment, hiring, and advancement of different demographic groups, and required that each agency head commit resources and submit reports to an oversight agency. And in 1969, even though EEOC was in existence, EEOC did not have the authority over federal sector EEO. That fell to another bureaucracy called the Civil Service Commission. And the Civil Service Commission at that time put out the rules, the regulations, laying out what was necessary to operate as what we call the model employer. And the Civil Service Commission had its own regs, had its own processes. But as we know, if you follow history, there was a reorganization of the federal government in 1978 under President Carter, which abolished the Civil Service Commission and moved certain functions that it occupied to other agencies. Of course, it created the Office of Personnel Management, the Merit Systems Protection Board, and then all things to do with federal sector EEO came to EEOC in 1979. And at that point, EEOC took the Civil Service Commission's rules, regulations, and then incorporated them into our own. And so, as you look at the history of this directive, it wasn't the first directive. The first directive we passed in this space was it was Management Directive 701. And that one dealt with what agencies needed to submit to EEOC. And at that time, we used the categories minorities and women. And it was a 2 year plan. And then we issued Management Directive 702, which was another 2 year plan, issued Management Directive 705, 707, and all of these were like multi-year plans. So for the years of 1984 to 1988 or 19, and I'm not having the dates right at the moment, but these were like multi-year plans that were reissued periodically. And in the disability space, EEOC was really trying to decide what was necessary to meet the obligations of the Rehab Act, which also had an affirmative action component, because the focus before was really on those things that aligned with Title VII. And in 1982, EEOC issued Management Directive 712, which really laid out what was necessary to be the model employer for individuals with disability and required agencies to submit multi-year plans to EEOC. That was followed up with Management Directive 713, which further defined what was necessary to be the model employer with people with disabilities. And then EEOC issued Management Directive 714 as the most up-to-date multi-year plan for what was called minorities and women, which aligned with Title VII's protections. So our history was we would issue these directives for saying, look at your program for these 3 to 4 years, submit a report to EEOC, EEOC will review it and get back to you. And, they were supposed to be limited life, but got to a point where we politically, because after the Supreme Court's decisions in Croson and Adarand, what affirmative employment and affirmative action meant changed, and it was not as easy to pass directives. So what the commission did was just extend some of these coverages. And so leading up to MD 715, there was a real need to move away from multi-year plans that changed, but to really come up with a policy document that would stand the test of time. That was the hope, that we could come up with a policy document that explained what the federal government should be doing as a model employer, both under Title VII and the Rehabilitation Act. And it had great challenges around it because politically, these are still, even in this time, because we know, if you change the acronyms to DEIA or some other acronyms, there was a lot of controversy around what it meant. The one thing that we always had at our back that was supported us as we move forward is that these things are statutory, because even though I talked about the executive order that President Nixon passed in 1969, Congress came back in 1970 and put those provisions in an amendment to Title VII that made it a requirement. So these programs were required by law. And so what we were looking at that time, going back to the early 2000s, really from the mid to late 90s to the early 2000s, is how do we define this in the scope that the law had developed in terms of affirmative action and the Supreme Court cases that we were seeing. And so that's the context that led us to moving to the creation of MD 715. So I want to introduce our first panelist today, Gail Black, who's an attorney, senior attorney in the Office of Federal Operation. You have the bios. I think the bios were sent to everyone in advance of the meeting. But Gail has I don't want to say a long career, but a stellar career in federal government, not only with the EEOC, but Department of Labor, Department of Education, and moving back and forth doing different places. And so Gail has been a rock in this area over the years. When she was in DC, she would periodically stop by my office to remind me of my obligations to do the work as she thinks that I should be doing them. And so I always look for her for advice, and she is one of the leaders in this space. So welcome, Gail.
Thank you. Thank
So
you very much.
Go
No
ahead.
problems. So the first question for you is, can you describe the initial inspiration or need for the creation of this new directive that was new at that time in 2003?
I can try. And first of all, let me just say, for those who aren't able to see me, and good afternoon. My hair is brown and gray. I'm wearing a black jacket and I have a multicolor scarf on right now. The initial inspiration, I think, came from just the experiences that I'd had. And I'm a bit of a nerd. I tend to get in the weeds with things and like to know the history. And I realized that at EEOC, especially having been at labor and seeing what powers were there, that EEOC had all the tools and the authority to do so much more. And all of the history gave us the basis to do it. It also happened that I'd come back to EEOC to work in 2001, and I was told this was an assignment, and our duty was to try to provide guidance in follow-up to what had already been the precursor. Dexter has gone through some of it, but actually back in, I think it was starting with the Pendleton Act in 1883, the concept of merit, and it was the early precursor to the Merit Systems Protection Board rules. In 1941, there was another executive order. And all that to say, we had been granted the authority back in 1978. EEOC had been granted that authority, but so many agencies still viewed others as being in charge of federal EEO. And that's not the case at all. And when Congress changed the law, Title VII, back in 1972, it changed the language so that it said there's an obligation for federal employers to make all of their actions free of discrimination. That's different. That's not just simply don't discriminate against an individual. That puts the onus on the government to do something to become the model employers that was intended. The reason for that is significant because federal dollars, there's a compelling reason for the government to be interested in this area. Federal dollars should not be used to perpetuate discrimination. And federal government is a big employer. And if we're ever going to address that systemic discrimination, it's through the federal government. And that was one of the impetus for changing the law and moving it out of the Civil Service Commission over to EEOC. Another big change that has happened and was part of the inspiration is that there was more accountability. There was government-wide accountability, new ways of looking at our effectiveness, including using data. And so that helped move me into thinking we need to be doing more. Also, having been on the federal sector side, on the federal contractor side at the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at Labor, I saw how these laws interplay, they interact together. And we had a great opportunity to do so much more. So we, I had the privilege of working on the Title VII side. Sandy Bryant worked on the Section 501, and I asked Sandra Minokin, please to help. She had the experience with OFO back then, and we worked on the side that dealt with Title VII. And although EEOC has many laws, MD 715 only addressed two, Title VII and Section 501, which deals with rehabilitation and individuals with disabilities. And we had to grapple with the idea that Section 501 requires affirmative action for individuals with disabilities. Title VII has dual enforcement. You're eradicating discrimination, but it also has a proactive component. but it bans discrimination. So how do we reconcile these two seemingly inconsistent laws? The Age Act, by the way, also has that same provision that Title VII says you have to make all your personnel actions free of discrimination. I think mainly we were inspired because, in my way of thinking, it's like having a house, having a mansion. EEOC is like a mansion, has many rules, many rooms, and in the back, we were living in the back house, a little teeny room, and all these other agencies were in front and not really allowing us to do all that we could do, and we were not doing all we could be doing. So my primary focus and objective with the MD 715 is to have more of a focus on that proactive prevention rather than just reacting to individual complaints, really getting in and looking at what we can do to have agencies do their own assessment, which was not anything new. It's been required for many years, and provide us with the basis to act. Can't hear you.
Sorry, I got that dreaded didn't unmute. But some of the questions I have, you may have already addressed. Like, I think the second question I was going to ask you is, what were the primary objectives you hope to achieve through MD 715?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a more efficient way of doing EEO and requiring the agencies to do the reasonable assessments and have a basis to act and then take reasonable actions. And again, this was nothing new. This was all spelled out already in our regulations, the requirements that you do a self-assessment, because that gives you the basis to act. And then you would be able to take legally, lawfully reasonable actions that could be defended in court. There were some early challenges. I'm anticipating the next question because this whole concept required a sea change in thinking, because and we still, to some extent, still focus primarily on individual complaints, one by one as they come in, which of course relies on somebody having the courage and the knowledge to know they're being discriminated against and coming forward. This takes it to an employer having an obligation that's not based on or premised on somebody raising a concern and then having a finding of discrimination, because that was the only time we could go after that remedial relief. This was something different. And again, it's addressing systemic, shifts that focus from individuals to systemic. The laws weren't understood and we weren't using them. And as you alluded, there was a fight back then over affirmative action and what does it mean? Some were calling it reverse discrimination. And I mean, I can remember challenges back then, terms like comparable worth and everything else was just confused. It wasn't until we started saying, wait a minute, sex-based wage discrimination is covered. It's part of what we can do. Then there was the problem in terms of how do you move from just a paper exercise where employers say, okay, I've got a policy, here it is, and that's it. I've satisfied it. How do you move from that to doing a focused, proactive assessment of whether or not there's still barriers that are impeding people? And that was another challenge. Another one was just, how do you define the relevant labor pool? Who are you looking? How are you comparing? And what is the obligation? And there was a distrust, I'd say, a little bit, because it seemed to be a deviation from FEORP. For those who don't know what FEORP is, it was a focus on minorities and women. It was the old way of looking at it and realizing EEO applies to everybody. All groups are protected, and that it's unlawful under Title VII to discriminate, while we were also trying to level that playing field so that everybody has a chance to participate, and that all mission critical occupations are open to everybody, and we can then get the benefit of everybody's talent. I was privileged to work at Department of Labor's Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, and I did get to see how federal contractors are required to have an EEO clause in every contract that's over $10,000, maybe more now. And it helped underscore for me the importance of federal dollars not being used to perpetuate discrimination. Federal contractors employed about a quarter of the private sector employees. That's huge. You couple that with the federal government employment record, and it just opens a whole new way of addressing systemic. At Labor, they also recognize the best practices and the policies of companies, private sector companies that were doing well in the area of EEO. They had what was called the EVE Awards every year. And these companies would work really hard to get on, to be highlighted by the Department of Labor for their efforts. Ironically, a company can be doing well in one area and maybe not doing so well in another area, but overall, these were some great companies, and it showed me that kind of having an honor roll is the way of approaching this. But my experience also came from working at EEOC on the private sector side, where I got to work on I saw some interesting issues. One reminds me of a case that involved a publishing company. I won't name it, but women were segregated into certain jobs. That was not unusual. So we challenged that, and we were able to show that the editors should not just be men. The editorial assistants should not just be women. And we were able to make a big difference in that case. Again, I recognize the folks like Sandra Minokin, who helped a great deal on this, Sandra Bryant, who helped a great deal, and of course, my great supervisor at the time, Kathy McNamara. And yes, and Dexter, I would come and ask you questions, and Robbie Diggs, I was blowing him up. And so yes, we were very, very fortunate to be able to make a difference.
Someone had asked a question in the chat, and the question is a little bit different, but their question was, you talk about, I'm paraphrasing, this is not exactly what they said, but you talked about Title VII and you talked about the Rehabilitation Act, but what about age discrimination? That's not covered in what we see here. And their question was, what are some of the things that we should be doing to protect, age discrimination against some of the folks who are older that's getting less favorable treatment than younger folks?
Yeah, again, it was just MD 715, when we were given the directions of updating, it was to focus on Title VII. And as I highlighted, ADEA has the exact same law. So those same sorts of assessments employers should be looking at that as well. All of the whole idea is EEO for everyone, and all of the laws that we enforce, we should be looking at. But the management directive deals with the proactive prevention side, if you want to think of it that way. Like 110 is looking at how you process a charge, a complaint. 715 is dealing with proactive prevention, all of the things that employers and we expect from the self-assessments and the reporting. And yes, my personal opinion, age is a component that we could do a whole different management directive, but I think it's covered. It should be covered in thinking. And the management directive itself, it's only 21 pages. I'm trying to grab it right now. I think it mentions age, but not in terms of the types of tables that need to be looked at.
Well, that's okay. I think they just want to know, and I think you explained that the scope of what required under MD 715 fell from Title VII and the Rehab Act, but that doesn't preclude the agencies from doing more. And so,
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know there are other bigger policy questions that came up in the chat. I'm going to save some of those questions for the end, but I want to
Okay.
thank Gail for giving us the context of what happened in the early formulation stages of the directive, and ask her to stand by because we want to keep you around just in case there are other questions that come up as we go through the remaining part of the panel. But thanks, Gail.
Thank you.
All right. And so now we want to bring to the stage Lori Grant. And Lori, is Lori on the spotlight yet? I'm not seeing her. Oh, there she is. Hey, Lori, how are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good, good. So, Lori was a longtime EEOC employee who left maybe a little bit over 2 years, no, less than 2 years ago. Now working over the Consumer Finance Protection, is it board or bureau?
Bureau.
Bureau as the deputy director of their civil rights program. But Lori was significant in our implementation of MD 715 as it went from a policy document we had to create operating instructions for agencies to explain how to implement, and then we had to do our oversight because, like Gail said, accountability was a big deal. Did we just want another paper exercise? And I think, as someone who's been around long enough to say, the the reports that came in under 712, 713, and 714 very much felt like a paper exercise. Agencies were saying, yep, we did this work, and here's the report. The report was the work. It wasn't like really changing the culture or making the workplace free from discrimination. And the reason why I say that from my perspective is like we would visit agencies and talk to leaders and say, what is your plans under this and that they submitted to us? And it would be rare that any of them knew what they had put in these plans. So they pretty much were paper exercises. And so Lori came in and became one of our leaders as a branch chief in the division that manages MD 715. And then shortly thereafter, she became the division director that really manages the implementation of 715. So Lori, with that context and you being one of the long-term leaders in the implementation, what were some of the key steps that were involved in giving this directive life and making agencies really take it serious?
I think the biggest step was actually building the agency oversight division so that we had the skilled staff, the number of employees who could reach out to agencies and provide them the kind of feedback that they needed. And working with you to do that from the ground up was truly, I think, one of the biggest successes in providing agencies with instant or at least pretty quick feedback when they had questions, providing comprehensive feedback letters routinely so that agencies would know that we're here, hold them accountable if necessary, provide them with positive feedback, and then continuing to groom staff so that they would provide the institutional knowledge and career growth within the office. And for example, every day I count my blessings that I hired Gul Chaudhry because I know that AOD will continue in the same path. So staffing aside, in terms of like programmatic achievements, I would say building it from the really having a systematic way of looking at MD 715. What is it that we wanted to highlight for agencies? Because Part G is a big document, and we know agencies couldn't do everything overnight. So what were the things that we were most concerned about to help them build their Model EO program? And I know we did this a little bit with the scorecard for a couple of years, but we also used it when we provided feedback and giving detailed examples of how we looked at triggers within agencies so that they could see what we were looking at and understand the kind of analysis that we were expecting agencies to do, because it was still relatively new concept. Working with other OFO staff to develop the root cause analysis tool, which would also give agencies a better understanding of how to do barrier analysis, what questions to ask. When they identified a potential issue, what would be the next step that they could do to identify where barriers might exist. So really giving agencies a framework to start with, because MD 715 provides examples of barrier analysis, but the skill set wasn't necessarily existing in agency offices, EO offices, and having to build that skill set. Another way was developing with Mark Plotkin the barrier analysis course and giving agencies staff the tools to be able to say, this is the trigger, where do I go now? What do I do next? So yeah, really giving agencies structure to be able to do the barrier analysis process effectively.
So thanks for that. This is not one of the pre-prepared questions. I'm gonna follow up on something you said. It's like one of the things that we do with federal agencies is they submit MD 715 reports to us annually, and then periodically, routinely, we will come out and schedule a technical assistance with the agency, and we would go over their progress and then give them a written assessment. The first letters that we submitted in 2004, I'll just say this: people call them like the slam letters because they said we were just harsh in our evaluation of agencies, and especially as an EO leader, and you get in this letter that's saying that the EO program has so many deficiencies, because we would we could say you have 20 programmatic deficiencies looking at Part G, which has 156 measures, so you're going to find some. So my question is, as we started giving our feedback to agencies, how would you describe some of the evolution in terms of the way that we did technical assistance and given those written assessments to agencies?
I would say really well, first I want to acknowledge I'm here as a personal capacity, not here representing CFPB. So I meant to say that earlier. I just wanted to make sure that's clear. I would say being even-handed and being complimentary so that it's best. And that's really what we strive to do in the feedback letters. Every agency is doing something well and maybe something not so well. And if we could share the pieces that they were doing well, the best practices, innovative practices with others, that those agencies can improve, and then also try to help the agencies where they had weaknesses. So providing a more even tone, I think agencies were more receptive to the feedback. And the other piece of it too is working with the agencies to find out how we could help them. Because MD 715 can be a very effective tool for EO directors to meet some of their needs. And if they came to us and said, we're really struggling with XYZ, how can we help the agency in the feedback letter to address that issue?
Thanks, appreciate it. And so, as you've had this opportunity to, and you were a part of the implementation and leadership of MD 715 for over a decade, in hindsight, were there things that we could have done different? Have you identified any weaknesses or problems with MD 715 that, it's a natural evolution? MD 715 itself is all about process improvement, always looking how you can do better. What are some of the things that if you could go back in time, what are some of the problems that are out there?
I think one of the biggest issues has to do with the turf battles that EO offices encountered in trying to implement MD 715. And I wish that if we had started over, and I know it's a different time and a different world, but have EOC and OPM be on the same page regarding many of the important requirements. For example, if I'm recalling correctly, OPM did not support the collection of applicant flow data at the time that MD 715 was rolled out. And that messaging pulled down to the chief human capital officers. So it became a struggle for agencies to obtain data, the data that they needed in order to complete the MD 715 data tables. If EOC and OPM had collaborated and coordinated, I think some of those turf battles may have been alleviated, perhaps. At the agency level, the EO offices and HR offices have to coordinate with one another on topics like information sharing, strategic planning, recruitment, barrier analysis efforts. I think it would be helpful for perhaps if there's the next MD 715 that maybe there's a joint statement issued, which would get the Chicos on the same path as the EO offices.
Okay.
Perhaps it wouldn't have taken a statute to get the EO director reporting to the agency head.
Right. So yeah, we're looking at, and that was looking back, but looking forward, now you're outside of EEOC, you're working at one of these federal agencies. And there were some questions in the chat, Lori, about, what is AOD, but the team explained what the agency oversight division within EEOC, they're the ones that do the technical assistance visits with federal agencies. And then there was a question, Lori, about do we do this with private employers? And we already explained in the chat, we do it, it's just for federal agencies. Um, but as you now sit outside of EEOC and you're working in an EEO program at a federal agency, what are some of the things that you would like to see for the future or improvements in this particular area? Understanding that you just shared, the better cooperation and better working relationship with OPM. But is there any other things that you would like to see for the future?
I want to start off by saying I love MD 715 and I hope that there aren't substantial changes because I think it's a great document. I would say maybe mandating a diversity council. Maybe that could be part of a joint letter with OPM so that the EO director and the Chico would be joint leaders, which would then require coordination between the offices. Which also goes toward improving the barrier analysis process because HR is a huge component of that analysis. I think that there's also an overlap with MD 715 Part HIJ and the DIA plans where they may not necessarily be coordinated. I would say ideally after a barrier analysis action plan is put in place, that the DIA plans could also incorporate the relevant action items and then automatically include those plans within the performance standards of the relevant officials. Because really accountability is the only way to achieve a successful plan. And if the other leaders outside of EEO, if they're just, let me put it this way, if the agency head it's a paper exercise to sign the report and the plans just stay with the EO office, a lot of the action items can't be accomplished. And I think having as much involvement as possible from the DIA piece of it and also the performance standards and work plans if agencies use those as well. The status and dynamic files, I think those were a huge step forward for agencies, particularly to get away from the Excel template. However, some agencies like mine can't use the files because of data inconsistencies. I think that if we could, in the next MD 715, change the reporting cycle from September 30 to the last day of the reporting period within that fiscal year, it would truly assist with having similar data for other reporting exercises. It's very difficult for an agency that's smaller to have discrepancies, I would say, where in one report it's the last reporting period, and then the other, I mean, it's the last pay period, and then the other, it's September 30, and you get different data for the same topics. And it's magnified with a smaller agency with percentages. Maybe a department agency, you have 2 or 3, it's a smaller number and the percentage isn't going to change radically. I'd like to see MD 715 expand into new topics, perhaps LGBT data, the anti-harassment data, and perhaps even reasonable combination data. For the anti-harassment program in particular, I think having EEOC's oversight over agencies' aggregate data could significantly improve their compliance with the EEOC guidance. Because right now, anti-harassment programs still really fall in that gray area between OPM and EEOC with not a lot of accountability, at least like direct accountability. So I think that could be really helpful. And then finally, well, 2 things. One would be working with OPM to add more EEO and harassment related questions in the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, so that perhaps there could be an EEO related quotient for agencies to utilize. And then also perhaps having a disability related CLF. And I know
Okay.
that costs money, but
Yeah. But Lori, I just wanted to personally thank you for all the service and your significant involvement and leadership in this area. Definitely have value. I mean, as much as anyone, you have embodied MD 715. I used to call you Lori MD 715 Grant. That used to be my nickname for you, but definitely appreciate you and thank you for participating. And stick around if there's some other questions that come about that you may be able to address towards the end of the presentation. But thank you.
thanks.
So the next segment we're going to talk about is some of the training efforts to really help agencies understand what's required under MD 715. I think, one of the surprises that I think we had as an organization when we first launched MD 715 is like Gail had shared that this wasn't new. This is things that agencies should have been doing for many years. But we found very quickly that, agencies were struggling with this concept of, you know, affirmative employment in the sense where you're trying to be the model employer, to root out barriers and things of this nature. So we really had to look at training in a different way. And so we're privileged today to have two of our esteemed colleagues, Mark Plotkin, who's the senior attorney advisor in our appellate review program, who at that time in the early MD 715 days served as a branch chief and an attorney advisor in our agency oversight division, and really one of the persons who helped develop training, along with Patricia St. Clair, who is now one of our associate directors in our Office of Field Programs, but for many years was the training and outreach director for the Office of Federal Operations, and really facilitated a lot of the training. So welcome you both to the stage and you've heard the context of the discussion, but can you each answer the questions? I don't know which order we're going in, but who's going first?
I'll let Patricia go first.
Okay, great. So Patricia, then followed by Mark. describe the training programs that supported the implementation of this management directive.
Okay, so first of all, let me start off by saying I love all things training. So thank you very much for having me here. Um, I'll say when I first thought about MD 715 rolling out and it being a new initiative, thinking about the type of training programs that supported it, my first concern went to the staff because this was a new directive that we were rolling out. And I thought about training, and my first thought was, how are we working to train our staff internally to ensure that they're able to go out and speak to our stakeholders and provide technical assistance and guidance. So one of the first things we did was develop internal training for all of this, for all of our EEO specialists, so that they would be able to go out and support the different federal agencies. They would understand the difference between barriers and triggers, and also what is this new MD 715 directive all about. Also, the other aspect I think that really supported the implementation of MD 715 is looking at the special emphasis program management training, and also sending a message out to the special emphasis program managers across the federal government, letting them know that you are a critical part of MD 715. Part of your role as a special emphasis program manager is to support your agency in their ability to identify barriers and triggers and look at the different programmatic deficiencies. So those are the two areas that we focused on. Mark, I'm going to turn it over to you. And first, let me say, Mark, I'm so glad to see you. I haven't seen you in a while, so I'm sending you a virtual hug.
Well, here's a virtual hug back.
Hi, Mark.
It's been a long time, and
Yeah.
thank you, Dexter, for making this possible. And I just wanted to say that I had been away from MD 715 for quite a few years. And then we had our homecoming last, I think it was September, and Dexter made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And that was to start teaching barrier analysis again. So I've started to do that. And quite a bit of it has changed since I was active full time with MD 715. But I want to just share what it was like to develop, to actually start thinking about how to distill the policy document and the implementation of MD 715 into a clear and coherent course. Because we were asking people, especially the EEO staff at federal agencies, we were asking them to do something they had never done before. I mean, up until MD 714, up through MD 714, it was just a matter of collecting the statistics, putting them in a report, and putting them on a shelf, and we'll tell you, let's see what happens next year. But this was the first time that they had been asked to actually do something with that data. And so, I give joint credit to, to Patricia and I. We worked on it together. And we took an in-depth look at the entire barrier analysis process as we understood it, based on our reading of the directive and of the of the efforts to implement. And what that effort entailed was to break the entire process down into manageable pieces, and then particularly start off with, how do you find triggers? I mean, that was really key, that and distinguishing triggers from barriers. And of course, we put the emphasis on workforce statistics, but we also told the agencies, you got to look at other things too. Okay, you've got to look at complaints data. Okay, survey results. And the example I like to use in training is an agency, a disgruntled agency, is in a bar, and he's grumbling about, between swigging his bottle of Coors Light, he's grumbling about the upcoming, about, we got to file a class action because the agency is really screwing us all over. And so we were teaching people to look for these things that you wouldn't that you have to make an effort to uncover. So it's a process of asking questions until you get to an answer. And I just wanted to also pay tribute to Patricia for bringing in the concepts of decision trees and mind maps. Who you incorporated that into the process. I think we brought them over from we brought those concepts over from a couple of social scientists. Where was it? At USDA?
Oh gosh, I cannot remember, Mark. My mind fails me. I want to
Okay,
say
but
Noah,
that's
but I
how,
don't
and
think so.
it gave
Yeah,
people a
Noah's
visual.
right.
Was it
Noah's right.
Noah? Okay, yeah, it
It
was
was
Noah.
Noah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't even close. But so that's really how the process got started. So we broke it down into 4 phases where we talked about trigger identification, um, barrier investigation, and doing that barrier analysis investigation to see if there really is a connection between the triggers that were observed and the situation that that was considered a barrier. Okay, and then developing action plans and then following up. The key thing to emphasize is this is an ongoing cyclical process. Okay, and issues come up where sometimes we'll either identify the wrong barrier and or sometimes the corrective measure will itself give rise to a new barrier. Now, what I remember, I was a supervisor for about 5 years, and we would look at the part of what we did was we look at the data tables and see what was going on. And we really, at least I didn't really see a lot of movement in the numbers between those 5 years. And I was starting to wonder, okay, is it possible that, that maybe they're just not getting it despite our best efforts? Or, and this is something I thought about within the last year when I started teaching barrier analysis again. I started thinking that, okay, a workforce is a system, which means there are so many interactions going on simultaneously. And the implication is that in systems analysis, it's not necessarily getting from point A to point B. Now, our root cause analysis, we tend to look at it in a linear fashion. We dig down to, the specific problem or the specific trigger that could be indicative of a barrier. Okay, a glass ceiling, for instance, not getting through. People not getting through to the upper echelons of the agency. So my question is, in terms of how barrier analysis might evolve in the future, I'm wondering if it may entail some kind of training in systems thinking to open up the possibility of finding more than one root cause. But that's just my opinion. And you guys have been working in, who are in AOD now. Maybe the numbers have gotten better since I left. Okay, well, I gone on and on enough, so I'll turn it back. Dex, you're muted. Can't hear you.
No, but it's a good thought going through those things. And so, Patricia, as Mark had gone through all the things that we had to do to, get the concepts out there in terms of developing a curriculum. I think we started off with, very basic training on MD 715, how to fill. I think the very first training was like how to fill in the report. And
Right.
so I think we spent, thousands of hours of training just teaching people how to fill in a report. But what was the evolution of the curriculum, and where did we go from how to fill in a report to the courses that we offer now?
So one of the key factors is really stepping back and trying to determine what are the needs of the community, what do our stakeholders need. Being able to fill in the report is great, and that's the first step. But then we have to start thinking about how are you analyzing this information and how do you bring MD 715 to life within your federal agency, because we always like to think about it as a living, breathing document that you're constantly working to develop your affirmative employment program throughout the year. By the time you submit your report, the work should have already been done. So, keeping that in mind, we wanted to be able to give stakeholders the tools that they needed to be able to analyze the data and analyze the information that they receive. So, we moved into a phase of looking at it in terms of two main areas: identifying the programmatic deficiencies and how do you resolve those deficiencies, and then looking at the triggers and then conducting barrier analysis. So, breaking it up into two main parts and then really diving deep into both areas. And then, even before we went into the barrier analysis piece, we developed a basic 1-day overview course. So, the way we structured the training was in a 3-day module. You had the 1-day basic and then the 2-day barrier analysis. And I'll turn it over back to Mark if you want to add to that.
Well, I really got started in this. I think the 1-day course was already up and implemented by the time
Yep.
I joined the team. So my work was principally developing the barrier analysis course. And what I can remember, in terms of where we started from, again, we didn't really have, it was just look at the data and then figure out where the triggers are. So but we had to show people how to do that. So one of the first things we did was we actually created an entire set of data tables. Again, we were using, the Excel spreadsheets, which I understand that process is all automated now. But, we would include, and the hardest thing about that was just filling in the numbers so that we could make, putting the right numbers in so that we, make it easier for the participants to identify the triggers. And then we came up with some various common scenarios. Of course, everybody knows what the glass ceiling is, in terms of being able to get through to the highest echelons. But we developed several other equally important, scenarios, including LEHI, which is low entry, high exit. Where certain groups coming into the workforce at lower rates, and then are they exiting at high rates? Glass wall, that covered ability to get into the major or mission critical occupations, and being able to move up, because those are the occupations where upward mobility is. Then, of course, the block pipeline, the difference. We had to explain quite often the difference between block pipeline and glass ceiling. Glass ceiling, as I mentioned earlier, was just trying to get to, the very, getting into the top positions, the executive positions. Block pipeline is where people cannot get into the feeder pool for those top positions. And so it was an evolutionary process. And I think the last thing that I worked on, I worked with Laurie. By the way, Laurie, it's really great to see you again. We worked on consolidating the data tables down from 15 to 9, which I think are the ones that are used now, where we would put the workforce participation rate together with overall recruitment and departure statistics all on one chart. So you had the participation rates at what we called stock data at a particular time, but you also had the flow data all on one chart, so that you could actually get a better sense of what was going on. Okay, I'll turn it back.
Okay, so we're running a little bit, but I'll end with the last question is, do you have any examples or anything that you would identify as a positive impact that our training has had on the community in terms of understanding MD 715?
Yeah, I will say that what it's done is that it's given federal agencies a certain degree of flexibility in terms of how they identify barriers and triggers. The way the training is designed is to teach people how do you create this vase? And then I always say you put different kind of flowers in the vase. Once you understand the template and the foundation for MD 715 barrier analysis, you're able to then take the foundation of that program and implement it to identify barriers and triggers and really create some lasting solutions in your workforce. And it's not going to happen overnight, but with the training, you'll really gain the tools that you need to understand that it's a slow moving process, that if you take these small bites at the apple, you will eventually get to the core. Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, I can't really add much more to that, except that, again, as I said earlier, it's an evolutionary process. And, Patricia, you just alluded to this. Agencies are confronted with a pretty daunting task, if they had the idea that, okay, well, we got to get all this done within a year. But I think the most important thing we did was to emphasize that, you just take a piece of it at a time that you can handle. You've got limited resources to put to this endeavor. So get to those things that are, to the extent you can, get to those things that are most visible. Okay.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Patricia. I'll just add this as context from my perspective in terms of the impact of training is, when we first, before we laid out MD 715 and we were operating under MD 713, 713, 12, and 14, it was rare that I would do anything in the public and folks knew what these directives were. But now, if I go to agencies and I meet with senior leaders, most of them know their MD 715. They know what they're being required. So I think the outreach and training effort has had a real impact. And want to thank you both for your contributions to this effort. So thank you so much. And so now we'll enter into our last segment before we try to take as many questions as we can, and we'll talk about the present and future of MD 715. And we're pleasant. It's pleasant to have Gul Chaudhry with us, and Lori Grant had mentioned her earlier as one of her biggest achievements was being able to lure Gul to our office many years ago. But Gould currently serves as the director of our agency oversight division, which is in the Office of Federal Operations, which deals with MD 715 and working with federal agencies on their efforts to be the model employer. And so Gould leads it, and she has 3 branches, and the branch chiefs are primarily here today. Crystal Grant, Ahmed Burse, and Anitra Grain all work on this. And so Gould, thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you, Dexter. I'm so happy to be here today to have this discussion. And thanks, Lori, for the kind words earlier. Appreciate it. It wasn't much luring, though, Dexter. It wasn't much luring.
I know. But we're still happy you're here.
Thank you.
So Gould, and you can see Gould's bio in the information that was shared. Can you provide us with an overview of the status and impact on MD 715? Pretty much, and I don't know if everyone here, and I'm thinking most people here are in the EEO field, but maybe kind of go through what we do with MD 715. How is it used today?
Okay, so I'll start with how it's used and what we do with it. So the Agency Oversight Division is a part of Office of Federal Operations, federal sector programs, and we provide oversight and manage the implementation of the MD 715. So each year, agencies are required to submit their MD 715 report along with the mandatory submission documents. And we review those MD 715 and all of the documents, workforce data tables, conduct technical assistant visits with agencies on a 3-year rotating cycle, and then provide feedback to those agencies based on trends that we're seeing within that self-assessment. So the status of what that is today is that we're monitoring 272 federal agencies and their Management Directive 715 reports, so their MD 715 reports. And in FY 2021, 79.8% of, I wanted to round it and just say 80, but I guess 79.8 is what it is. So they've certified their MD 715 report, and they were taking an average of 199 days to complete those reports from the time of when they initiated the process within our portal. For FY 2022, we had 83.6 agencies certifying their reports. And at that point, agencies were taking about 127 days from start to finish. So I think there's been an increase every year, and I'm hoping we're still in FY23 right now. We're hoping to surpass that 83.6%. And the importance of certification versus an agency just submitting the report to us, actually going through the motions and certifying it, affects the way that the EEOC does their oversight and our benchmarking, right? So once that data is input into our FedSep system, we're able to take a look at that data and come up with benchmarks agency-wide, whether we're looking at department levels, subcomponents, small and micro agencies. It really does impact the way that we're able to do oversight. And, and I can say over the past decade, because yes, it's now been officially a decade since I've been with the Office of Federal Operations last month. We've made some great, enormous strides, I think, as federal agencies. One of the things that I really appreciate and I see is that agencies are really taking, taking the approach of recognizing where their shortcomings are, right? And there's still going to be some agencies that may not answer accurately for whatever reason they decide not to. But there is an enormous shift of agencies coming to the understanding that answering the report or the compliance indicators really does assist their program as a whole. Some of the other major impacts I would say is because agencies are required to submit mandatory submissions like reasonable accommodation procedures, anti-harassment policy and procedures, submitting those allow the EEOC then to do official reviews of those documents. And one of the impacts is that 90% of the agencies that we've reviewed, their reasonable accommodation procedures are compliant. 80% of agencies have compliant anti-harassment policies. So it's impactful in ways that touch employees every day. And I think overall, if I would say what the impact is, I think it's really guided agencies in creating a workplace where employees can thrive, or at a minimum, given agencies the tools necessary for them to create that workplace.
Okay. So, one of the things that MD 715 does is the report itself, the agency submits different parts. They give a state of the agency, and then they go through the Part G checklist that we've referred to, which has 156 measures of what it means to be a model employee. And those are like yes or no questions that they're filling out every year. And if you fill out a no, that means there's a deficiency, and we expect the agency to create an action plan to address that deficiency. So, as agencies are going through that self-assessment every year, what are some of the what's the common deficiencies are we seeing at agencies when they're submitting their MD 715 reports over the last few years?
So I guess first I want to say is that I think each agencies, depending on size, struggles with different types of deficiencies. While I can give like a general, I think there are some things that are more prevalent for larger agencies that may not be for smaller agencies. But just overall looking at government-wide as a whole, I think reporting structure. Ensuring that the EO director reports to the agency head is a common deficiency. Just looking at FY22 data, 71% of federal agencies answered that they are compliant to this requirement, meaning that 29% are not. When we dig deeper and look at organizational charts, because we're not solely looking at only the MD 715, but also looking at those documents that Dexter and I both mentioned. So that's a deficiency. Another one is the issuance of timely FADs. There's a great report with
And
recommendations.
tell them what a FAD is, because some of them
Final
don't know our
agency
acronyms.
decision.
Go
Sorry,
ahead.
final agency decision. Issuing a final agency decision timely is a regulatory requirement. And so, as a government as a whole, I think we struggle with this. In 2018, we were at like 61%, ensuring that we were issuing them timely based on the regulatory time frame. In 2021, we were at 47%. So it's one of those, I think, government-wide that we're all struggling with. Um, Posting affirmative action plan for people with disabilities it was a requirement under Section 501. Again, about 79% of federal agencies, according to 2022 data, struggle with posting. And a lot of times when we go in and take a look at the affirmative action plan, maybe from 2018, 2019, not necessarily the new one. Barrier analysis, I think, is still, and I know we've mentioned barrier analysis in every one of our talking sessions, but barrier analysis is also something that agencies have struggled with, either with being able to capture that applicant flow data or other data, or being able to take that data and analyzing it in a way. And the reason why barrier analysis, I think, is so agencies struggle with it is because you're pinpointing a policy, practice, or procedure within your own agency, right? And saying, well, this could be problematic. And so, agencies struggle with that. And lastly, there's 156 measures, so I'm not going to go through all of them. But the last thing I think really trending the last year is a completion of RA requests in a timely fashion based on the agency's policy itself. Agencies have struggled with ensuring that they are doing the interactive process and making decisions in a timely way. So that's another thing that I think agencies have been struggling with.
Thanks, school. And I think we've asked this to others, but in terms of looking towards the future, what types of future enhancements or changes do you foresee, as it relates to the Management Directive 715?
So the last revisions we took were in 2017, and they were guided by Section 501 of the Rehab Act. So we had made several changes incorporating the affirmative action plan within the MD 715 report, and we're all aware that there's new pieces of legislation, including the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. We have the Cummings Act, and then we have regulations for PWFA and enforcement guidance on harassment. So what I foresee and I hope is that we can streamline the 156 measures to incorporate some of these new requirements without overly burdening agencies, and kind of hoping that we can assist agencies of meeting those requirements in a way that is helpful. Next, and I think Lori spoke to this as well, is the way that we are collecting workforce data. I know this year we deployed our first phase of workforce data tool in FedSep. We're listening to the community and really recognizing that there is some changes that need to be made on how we're collecting data, giving agencies opportunities to submit it in different forms. So what I foresee is for us to also streamline the way that we're analyzing or allowing agencies to submit that data.
So, cool. I had other questions, but we're running short on time. Is there anything else that you wanted to add in this segment about the future?
Let me see. No, because I think everyone else did a great job in saying how we can make some improvements with the future of it. I think the most important is just making sure this is a collaboration for the EO community as a whole. While we recognize EOC does have this oversight responsibility, but making sure that we're including the voices of our EO community as we venture through, the next phase of MD 715. I think we've gotten to the point where we recognize the importance of the essential elements, but we really need to move to the next step of, how do we continue to move forward in ensuring that, it's embedded within our agencies. So looking at, while it's a heavy lift for the EO office to ensure that the Management Directive 715 is followed, the report is completed, but really getting agencies on board with it's a whole of agency approach versus just one office's heavy lifting.
Well, thanks, School. And like Lori said, we're in good hands with you as our lead manager for MD 715. It's really great to have everyone here as a panel, whether from Gail, from the inception, from the implementation to where we are now. There's a strong history and support for this management directive. The commission itself really believes in it. I mean, some of the times, and I know and we'll get to some of the questions in the chat about the political environment. I just like to remind folks, like when we look at the history, like I started off with the executive order in 1969 that really created the framework for affirmative employment. That was passed during the Nixon administration. So it was a bipartisan belief that people should be able to compete on a fair and level playing field, the model employer, not giving preference to anyone. And then when we look at MD 715, which was passed in 2004, it was passed during the Bush administration, and it was a unanimous commission of all five commissioners voted to support. At the EEOC, the commission is composed of both parties, political parties, Republican and Democrat, and the president gets three members, and the party outside of the presidency gets two. And at the time MD 715 was passed, all the commissioners, Republican and Democrat, passed it. So it's a document we're proud of at EEOC. We think it really is the pathway to being a model employer, but it's constant work. You're always constantly reassessing where you are. And so we'll really appreciate your work. So now I'm going to ask Ahmed Burse, who's one of our branch chiefs in our agency oversight division, has been monitoring the questions. And there have been some questions that align with the different presentations, but some may have not. And so Ahmed, if you don't mind sharing some of the questions, and any of the panelists who want to jump in, happy to yield the mic to you. But Ahmed, what's the first question?
Good afternoon. One second, I'm pulling it up. I've been putting them in the chat to make sure I caught everything. The first question it was from Sam Caucus, and I apologize if I didn't pronounce it right. And this was in the beginning when you were speaking, how does the federal government plan to address increasing age discrimination against seniors, people of color who discriminate against by employers who give favorable treatment to younger people? And I believe you answered that question, but I'm
Yeah.
just putting it back out there.
That's okay. And we did answer it. In terms of MD 715, the policy guidance, it aligns with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and the Rehabilitation Act, which covers race, color, national origin, religion, sex, and then disability. But for the affirmative employment portion of it, the Age Discrimination Act also says you don't discriminate, but it doesn't have the same provision for submitting information. So what we do is we look at age separately. It's not a part of this directive, and we do monitor it. I think we put out some recent reports on our website. If someone could share, and one of our team share one of the reports we put out looking at age discrimination in the federal sector. We track it differently, but it's not a part of the MD 715 analysis. And then Gail gave some context to that question already as well.
And then someone had put in chat, Terrence Edwards did ask the question, where is the MD 715 going with some of the recent court decisions and companies deciding to remove diversity-based programs?
Right. So MD 715 is not a diversity-based program, just to start with that. It is a statutory requirement for federal agencies. Gail shared with you the amendments to Title VII in 1972, which required the federal government to have affirmative employment programs. Make it, and they used to call it positive employment. We call it model employment now. And then the very next Congress, the next year, 1973, because we had the 72 Congress passed this law. The 1973 Congress, which is basically the same Congress, passed the Rehabilitation Act with its affirmative requirements and made those the requirements on the federal government. So, a voluntary DEIA program, while they may be doing some things very similar to a EEO program, they can be doing things differently. And so our guidance has always been under MD 715 aligned with the Supreme Court's decisions in Adirondack, Croson, even the Students for Fair Housing cases. where we say employers should not make decisions based on numbers. You should not. That was one of the big things that started with MD 715. We had, the legacy of looking for parity. So you have a number and you're trying to meet this number. So you're hiring towards a numerical goal. And with MD 715, we took away that effort to meet a numerical goal. A numerical indicator can be a trigger of a problem, but it's not the end goal. The end goal is to look at that trigger and then do an analysis as to why that number is low. And once you figure out why it's low, then you have the opportunity to change whatever the policy, practice, or procedure that's affecting that particular procedure. So if it's a recruitment strategy that's too narrow, now we can expand recruitment. And by expanding recruitment, we're going to create greater opportunity. So it's not number driven. And so when you see the Supreme Court cases that people were a little bit alarmed with last summer in the education framework, which are not employment cases, and that's what we try to explain to folks over and over again, that those cases from last summer were about school admissions. They were not about hiring and employment. Those cases dealt with where there were number set asides for admissions, which if you did that under our laws, just to be honest with you, and I'm gonna speak for the entire team here, that we would find it discriminatory. So we don't say you don't set aside or you don't make decisions based on numbers, but under MD 715, your effort is really to look for the underlying root cause of disparity and tend to fix that. And so I use the medical diagnosis. If we're just treating the symptoms of discrimination, which are like the no numbers or high complaints and things of that nature, we're not getting to the root cause. It's like if you go to the doctor and all they're treating is your cough and your sneeze, but then never looking at the underlying disease, you're not going to correct it. And that's what we're looking at, the underlying correction that caused the disparity. And that effort has not been challenged in court and has not been, we may have had one case challenge it in a federal court, but it was quickly dismissed because our approach is based on not numerical parity, but based on removing obstacles. Did anyone want to add to that?
There was a follow-up to that. Do you want to speak on the follow-up or move on to that next question?
You're the moderator. What do you think? Whatever you think.
We can do the follow-up and then move on to the next question. So then the follow-up was, hold on.
I think in the chat, the person said you can move on, Ahmed.
Okay. All right. The next question, this was for Patricia. From Lamont, I didn't put his last name in. How have evolutions in technology, AI, impacted training for and on the MD 715? An example being, has AI been used to predict triggers for different agencies based on workforce data tables and enable the EEOC to tailor training and or make it more agency specific?
Hi, that's a great question, Dexter. How is AI being used in MD 715 in our federal parts of the world?
All right, thanks for that question, Patricia.
You're welcome, Mr. Brooks.
Well, I'll say this, Patricia. We're not sure how AI is being used to address disparities because it's not something, at least Google may be able to jump in and share if we've seen anything in MD 715 reports. One thing we did ask last year of agencies, we wanted to know, were you using AI in your hiring efforts and your recruitment efforts? And we surveyed agencies, and we're still trying to understand it. But I don't know if that question, Patricia, was really related to training. Maybe the person, if they want to come off mute, Ahmed, if they raise their hand and come off mute, they could give us some more context so that we can answer it. I don't know who the person was, Ahmed, and if they use the raise the hand feature, we can unmute them. And that's Sam.
Lamont Smith. Lamont Smith.
Oh, I'm sorry. I unmuted Sam because his hand went up. Sam, was that you? You can unmute now, Sam. Now you have to actually unmute yourself.
Sure. So anyway, it's in regard to actual recruiting. Like if you're applying for a job with, say, OpenAI or any of these uh, internet companies that are doing generative AI, like let's see, what's one of them? Yeah, OpenAI.com is one of them.
Yeah.
And, I think that they often don't want to give if you apply for one, there are several dozen or hundreds of jobs. They often don't uh, want to give an interview to somebody who's an older person who happens to be a person of color. And if that person's got like 20 years of say, investigative experience for an investigator job, why can't you give that person an interview while you're willing to hire or even give an interview for somebody who's younger, just out of college, and they don't have any experience at all?
Oh,
That
thanks,
is
Sam. But I got you.
egregious.
But your question was not the AI. It was about age discrimination. I think what we would, and thanks for the question, Sam. I think one of the things that we would do, and Lori Gould, Patricia, all of us, what we would do is we're looking at disparity. So we would see if there was a significant drop in that demographic pool where opportunities, like when new hires were coming about, and that pool was not being hired at the rate they are in the labor market. And if that's the case, we would ask the agency, what tools are you using to screen candidates? And if they say they were using OpenAI as a screening mechanism, then we would want to know how that works. What are the components of that, and how is it programmed? Because AI is only as sophisticated as those who program it. So if it's programmed in with a bias against this particular demographic group, then that's going to manifest itself in the selection process. So our approach is, we would, of course, we would have to learn of it through some effort. And so, Sam, definitely, share your information where you work with someone on the team, and then, maybe we can look into it. But that's the approach that we would take. Ahmed, next question. Or are we out of time? I think we're out of time.
I can ask it real quick, or
Nah, I mean, we'll try to save it. If anybody had a burning question and you want to send us your email address with your question in the chat, we'll definitely follow up with email, because I know folks have tight work schedules. But really have enjoyed this opportunity to actually, I always love the opportunity to get with my colleagues. So, in this post-COVID world, we still don't see each other enough, and so it's really great to see folks. For those who don't know, Gail and Mark are both on the West Coast. Gail's in Los Angeles, Mark's in the San Francisco area, and then some of us are on the East Coast, some of us in the Midwest and Texas. So it's kind of nice to have the EEOC team and the alumni here all together. And really appreciate the questions and folks sticking with us, and really thank you for your work as a community on MD 715. A policy document is only as good as those who are out there implementing and working on this. And so if you've been working in this field for many years, thank you. If you're someone who just joined this community and starting to learn about it, thank you. And if you just had an intellectual curiosity and you wanted to know more about this directive and our approach, and then you have ideas for moving on for the future, then definitely stay in touch with us, because this is like I said before, a policy document we're very proud of. At least in my career, I think it's the most significant policy document that I've worked on in my over 30 years in federal government. So thanks to the panel, thanks to the participant, thanks for the team behind the scene that managed this. Sorry for any technical difficulties. I know some folks said that they couldn't see the interpreters, but we surveyed the team and the people out there, and most folks could see the interpreter. So we'll try to brainstorm to see if there was anything, because they are highlighted and identified as interpreters. So stay tuned for our next EdCon event. I don't know which one we have scheduled. I think there are several things that we're anticipating. And look out for those emails. If you get a chance and you haven't already signed up, join our EdCon community and go to our homepage at EEOC under our tab for federal sector. And when you do that drop down menu, you should see a drop down for Education Consortium. Join our mailing list. happy to have you as a part of the community. And with that, in 3 minutes over time, thank you and have a great rest of your day.